Hello, sorry that we're a couple of minutes late as per usual. This is a new opportunity for us. My good friend, Tim Modise, here he is. You're going to see lots of Tim on the Thursday noontime webinar. And in fact, this is his show. So I'm Alec Hogg. I'm just here to hand over to Tim and to welcome all of the Biznews community to what is promising to be a fascinating conversation. All right, Tim, all yours.
Well, thanks very much, Alec, for this opportunity and our reunion, so to speak, here on Biznews. And as you say, every week we will be bringing you these webinars. So the first one, that is my debut in 2020 under the lockdown conditions, is focusing on education, something that is very topical for so many of us in South Africa at the moment, a very controversial issue at that, with the unions on one side saying that they do not think that the education system is ready to reopen the schools. And on the other side, other commentators and parents groups saying that the schools must be reopened. And let's remember that this is happening against the backdrop of the COVID case numbers rising to 395,000 as we speak, and close on 6,000 mortalities or deaths in South Africa. And of course, the shocking number yesterday of 572. So this is a bit confusing for everybody and very concerning for that matter. But I've got Basil Manuel, who speaks on behalf of the second largest teacher organization in the country, Naptosa. And Basil will be talking to us about the concerns of the unions with regards to the opening of the schools. And Nic Spaull, who is a senior researcher with the economics department at the University of Stellenbosch, and he's written extensively making a case for the schools to be reopened and for the economy for that matter. He's got 6 key points that he talks to, Nic Spaull. So he will be telling us a bit more about that. Now,
sorry, I just got to jump in here. I forgot, Tim, that to remind everybody that this is interactive.
Yes.
And that there is a little question bar. When you have a look on your screen, you'll see a little question mark. When you click on the question mark, that will open up a box into which you can write your questions. Stuart will pick it up from there. In fact, Stu, you've got some other technical issues, I guess, that we need to sort out as well.
Excellent, thanks, Alec, and welcome, Tim. Always good to have you around.
Yeah, just well, thanks very much, yeah.
Those people new to the webinars, we do like to keep them very conversational. As Alec mentioned, there's little questions dropped down on the control panel on the right-hand side. Please put your questions in there, and I'll pass them on to Tim and the guests. Just before that as well, if you can see 3 cameras, Tim, Nic, and Basil, and hear my voice, there's a little high five function on your control panel as well. If you can see and hear, then we'll know everything's coming through loud and clear. Lovely to see it. So we've got lots of high fives there, so all ready to go.
And before sorry, I just want to show Tim one last thing, because you can only do this when you're live. Tim, if you want to go off camera, you just click that.
Okay.
So right. Tim's now off camera, and we've got the 2 good-looking guys. And if you want to go back on camera, there it is. Okay. And this really is live, and it really is the first time we're doing this. So
yes.
Okay, my friend.
Learning on the spot, learning on the job, so to speak. But anyway, as we were saying, this is a big topic for us, and I'm quite chuffed, quite excited that we are hosting this. But it's something that I hope down the line will contribute to the decision-making process on whether to open the education system or not. And this is not unique to South Africa, by the way, this hot topic. It is happening, the debate is taking place everywhere in the world. In Kenya, they just went straight up and said they're going to shut the schools down, and they'll write this 2020 academic year off. But in South Africa, we're not so clear of what we want to do. So, gentlemen, let me start with you, Basil. Welcome. Thank you very much for agreeing to be on this webinar. And Nic, welcome as well. Thanks for being on the panel. And you go first, Basil. Tell me, why is Naptosa concerned about what the education department has promised South Africa, has promised yourselves, has promised parents that they will do? We've seen images, reports of that the schools were being sanitized and sanitizers were being made available. Masks were being made available, and that they were going to reopen the schools in a staggered fashion. But still, you are calling on them to postpone this. The year is almost over, Basil. Tell me why you think it's not being managed the right way.
Good afternoon, Tim and Nick, and as well as everybody else that is tuned in. At first, let me make it very clear. Naptosa, and mind you, not any of the other teacher unions, has called for a suspension of the school year. Not at all. In fact, we've advocated for the opening of schools under the right conditions. We've also been the ones that have ensured that the opening of schools did happen. However, at that point when we were supporting the opening of schools and demanding that certain conditions be met, and those are fair conditions in terms of ensuring that schools are safe, that they're clean, and that, of course, those measures which keep our teachers safe, that those are our members, as well as the learners by extension, that they are regularly met. Now, what we see currently happening is that a number of provinces have been unable to draw in the second and third cohort of learners to come back to school. And now we talk about the Eastern Cape, KZN, parts of Limpopo, parts of Mpumalanga. And that then lets the alarm bells ring. The question is, why did the second and third cohort not come back? Simply because provinces haven't been able to deliver on those basics that separate what we would say is the things that make schools safe from the things that make them unsafe. And that is one of our concerns. But of course, our call is much broader than that. It has to do with the relatively long period many people have been busy with education. It has to do with the fact that we are saying we are in the heart of winter. And of course, we are also saying that nobody is attending to the psychological impact this is having on our teachers. And for that reason, we are saying, given the peak is near us, or so we are told, but more so given the panic that it has created and the psychological impact on our membership, that we need to have a break, not to close the schools for the year. And I think this is where some of the confusion comes in. We've asked for a break, and this break to coincide with this time, midwinter and the peak. Now, I know that we can't exactly define when the peak is going to be. However, let us look at it in its real perspective. We were going to have a few days of closure now. We were going to have another week and a few days a little later. So what is being called for is an additional 2 weeks. But there have been a number of suggestions that we are trying to cancel the year and so on. Not at all. We actually believe and subscribe to the view that schools are the safest place for children, and that we want to see our children at school. However, our membership as teachers, we've also got to look after their well-being. And quite honestly, the state has failed our teachers in terms of looking after their well-being.
Thanks very much, Basil, for that. And Nic, let's hear the outline of your views and what you think should be happening now.
Sure. So maybe, Tim, let's start with what we agree on. So I actually know Basil and I know each other. We have a history, and I think that there's respect on both sides. So I think, firstly, I agree. No teacher should return or be forced to return to a school if there's not adequate PPE or masks. If there's not sanitizer and people cannot practice the types of recommendations being made by government, they should not be forced to go back to school. Schools need to be equipped before teachers are expected to go back. So that's the first one that I think we can agree on. The second thing I think we can agree on is that schools are the safest place for children. So I'm glad that Basil mentioned that because I think that's a really important point. Now, the reasons why I have a different opinion around why I think schools should not close now. The first one is that we're starting to see really concerning rates of child hunger, and this is partly attributable to the fact that the school meals and the school feeding program are not being implemented in at least 8 provinces. So 9 million children normally rely on that, and we're seeing child hunger rates more than double compared to what they were in the past. It's very difficult to think how you feed 9 million children if schools are closed and if teachers are not attending school. So that's the first point. The second one is that it's not only that we should be asking what is in the best interest of teachers, we also need to be asking what's in the best interest of South Africa. So I understand where Basil is kind of representing his members, and that's his role, and that's the role of the unions. But I think as South Africans, what we need to be asking is how best can we fight this pandemic? So there's 650,000 healthcare workers, for example, and 4.5 million essential workers. What must happen to their children while they are on the front lines fighting this pandemic when schools are closed? We don't have childcare facilities for 4.5 million people. And then the last 2 points that I'll mention, the one is that the medical experts and advisors, including the South African Pediatric Association, Professor Salim Abdul Karim, the head of the Ministerial Advisory Committee, and a number of other medical and epidemiology experts are saying that schools are not sites of much higher rates of transmission, that teachers are more likely to get infected outside of schools than inside of schools, and that teachers are at no additional risk or at a very low additional risk by being at schools. And that evidence is supported by the Western Cape, which had its surge while schools were open, as well as in Gauteng, where, for example, I'm looking at the stats now, in Gauteng, only 96% of schools reported no more than 3 cases. In other words, we don't see clustering. We don't see outbreaks in schools. That's an unfounded risk, or it's an unfounded assumption that people have, that schools are dangerous places for teachers or pupils to be. So Tim, let me pause there to basically say that teachers are not at additional risk, and that I think that it's a legitimate expectation that they should be at schools, and that we need to keep schools open, because we can't flick a switch to switch on and off schools as if it's a light switch.
Thanks very much, Nic. And there's also another view, Basil, which I'd like to hear your opinion on. I've seen people float this idea that if teachers are insisting that they stay away from work because of their concerns, then they shouldn't be paid for that time. That it's fine. They should exercise their right to protect themselves and keep themselves from what they regard as an unsafe environment at schools. And during that period, that they should not be paid any salaries. What's your view?
Okay, Tim, if I may just respond to some of the things that have been mentioned by Nic. First of all, in terms of the feeding and the feeding schemes, this is what teachers do. These are the other things that schooling is for, social aspects. It's not the core function, but they're there. And we subscribe to the view, and we have embraced the view that we need to ensure that the feeding schemes continue. However, even in lockdown, we've had feeding schemes continue. And what we are saying is that there are many ways in which to continue doing this. And it's teachers who make it work. There are many people who are clamoring around the feeding, but have not really walked that path. And I'm saying to you, teachers make it work. And they will make it work because there are methods to make it work. And this is what we have presented as well. You see, our memorandum for the public has been very, very short and succinct and mentioning a few points. It hasn't shown all the detail that we've built into that. Insofar as people talking about teachers not being different to anybody else, etc. Teachers are different. They are different in that they are in contact with many, many more people than the average person is, and or that the average even health worker is. However, I want to take nothing away from the pressure on the average health worker and the work that is done there. So that is not the point. The point I'm making is that the vulnerability that people feel, irrespective of what it is based on, is still real. Teachers really feel that they are vulnerable. They do feel, and of course, this builds anxiety, and this is why we are talking about assessing more and, of course, researching more on the vulnerability that teachers are feeling, the psychological impact that this has on them. Insofar as whether you are paying teachers or not, let me put it this way, Tim. Remember, teachers are entitled to a holiday. It's a statutory thing. And what we are asking for is, we're not asking for a closure of school. We don't subscribe to that view where people want to shut schools down. What we are saying is, let's have the break at a time that is convenient to us, that is convenient because it will help still some of those fears that are running rampant there. Now, you can point to stats, you can tell me that schools are not as infectious, etc., and that is true. We've also sat down and we've chatted with people like Professor Modise. Them have been our advisors throughout this period, and that is what convinced us to go back in the first place. However, none of that addresses the the psychological impact on teachers. None of it does. And you can't take that away. Your average teacher, your average teacher also is the person that continues working even when schools are closed, even when you reach home, unlike most other professions. And so people forget that, and people forget just how much is being done, not only in your well-heeled schools, but especially in your schools that are battling, because those people have sacrificed from their own pockets to see that some of the learning continues to happen. And that is largely underreported. But I need to also just say to Nic, we are of a distinct view as well, that there has been a vast underreporting of incidents in schools. We know and have facts at hand about concealment by the Department of Education itself, by district officials, and by schools, strangely enough, because they think that having a positive case will give them a bad reputation. And then by teachers as well, even our own members. Some of them have just evaporated, and we don't know what has happened to them. And we start getting calls about, we don't know where these 2 teachers have gone. Meanwhile, they've tested positive and have told nobody. Irresponsible, but that has been the experience that we've had throughout this whole pandemic.
Well, Basil, I want to say a little bit with that point that you've just made, that there is concealment, which would be regarded as extremely reckless on the part of the authorities to hide this information away from yourselves as teachers and teacher unions, but as well as the public, the South African public. Now, how can we trust and believe the information that we're given by the authorities if you are saying that within your environment at schools that you know of instances where teachers and even children, I would like to believe in some instances, have contracted or are infected with COVID-19, yet those cases are not being reported? Because that's reckless and dangerous, isn't it?
Very, very much so. In terms of the stats that are out there, I'm not saying they're totally useless. What I am saying is that I don't believe they are 100% correct. And we've seen that. I can quote to a school down in KZN that had, on its 10th case only, was there a report that was made, and then the school had been closed. That doesn't say that the people weren't taking other measures and by stealth seeing that the place is cleaned, etc. But this is what is happening. I won't call it a rash out there, but I want to acknowledge that it is happening, and that is why I'm saying the stats would probably be a bit higher.
But Basil, if I can come in there, I think that you raise a really important point, that underreporting of teachers, which would then knock on into an underreporting by the department because they're getting their information from schools, that is a serious issue. And even in the reports that I've seen in the Western Cape and Gauteng, that's one of the things that's mentioned as a possible uncertainty, is that maybe these numbers are underreported if teachers are not reporting at higher rates. But an alternative source of data comes from the Western Cape, which is hospital admission data. So obviously the Western Cape had its schools open during its surge, which happened before the other provinces, and yet we don't see higher admission rates of children for COVID-19 at hospitals in the Western Cape, despite the fact that schools were open during the surge. So you mentioned earlier this idea that teachers are in contact with a lot more people than others and therefore at higher risk. But we also know that children don't transmit this virus in the same way that adults do. I think that the advisors you've mentioned, Prof. Mehdi, Prof. Abdul Karim, have all made this really clear, that the vast majority of studies that are out there are pointing to the fact that kids don't transmit this in the same way that adults do. So yes, maybe you have 10 or 15 teachers that adults that teachers are surrounding themselves with when they go to school. But the studies that I'm referring to kind of make the case that teachers are more likely to bring the virus to school than they are to get the virus at school. And I think that that's a really important point, that healthcare workers are at much, much higher risk. I mean, the number I'm looking at is 600% higher compared to 10 to 20% higher for teachers. Now, why are we asking nurses to be on the front line, but we can't accept this slightly higher risk for teachers to play their part in all of this? And maybe the part of the answer to that is that the department and the unions need to do a much better job of communicating to teachers so that they don't feel so afraid and vulnerable. Because a lot of the stats that are out there, I think, do point to a much more reassuring picture than the media and the public are usually exposed to.
Nic, would you agree that the incidence of infection in our high schools is actually bucking the trend, the international trend? We've had far more infections than was generally accepted to be the norm. But I want to agree with you that in terms of communication, it has been abysmal. We haven't had much communication, not to start off with, and even now, the communication is largely from the media. And of course, you know, people select what they want to read. And yes, sometimes it's the hyped up information. I'm pausing because I saw you wanted to respond.
No, I think it's fair to say that the department has not done a good job with communication here. They haven't been transparent around their delivery of PPE to schools that haven't needed it or that haven't received it yet, and also around what the plans are when schools and teachers test positive. So I'm agreeing with you there. On the evidence of South Africa's secondary schools bucking the trend, no, not the data that I'm seeing from the Western Cape and from Gauteng. It's true that there are lower levels of child infection in primary schools than there are in high schools. So that's true. And that's also one of the reasons why when we were talking about opening schools, I said we should have started with the youngest children who are at the lowest risk. Everyone accepts that. And they also have the highest childcare burden for their parents. But even if we look at secondary schools, we don't see clustering of cases. We don't see big outbreaks, at least of that are reported. So maybe there are schools that have 20 or 30 cases, but they're not reporting it, in which case we wouldn't know. But at least on what's reported, we're not seeing that clustering, even at high schools. Except, of course, that school in Mount Frere, where we had those hostelites, the 200 kids. Earlier on. That's a good example of we should those sorts of isolated cases. I mean, Basil, you know the stats. We have 25,000 schools. Yeah. We can't be making decisions based on one school in Mount Frere of whether we should be opening or closing schools. And if we do have outbreaks like that, we should isolate them and close that particular school and maybe even a neighboring school, but not all 25,000. But the point is bigger.
All right. Let me move the conversation a bit forward, and we do have several questions that we've received here. One is a question about the first-time students at universities and technicons and TVET colleges being prejudiced next year. That if there's no progress made this year, and already we've lost how many months? 4 or 5 months of learning, and the calendar this year. Ultimately, if we go all over the place and do not take decisive action now to reopen or shut the schools down, then that is going to compromise the future of those who are in grade 12 at this time. So, Basil, I mean, how much time do we have to go all over the place with this decision? Reopen or shut down the schools, one or the other, and it has to happen now, not later.
We certainly are not advocating for the shutting down of schools. However, let me say, part of what we had suggested also with the break is that we would forego what is an agreement in our in the PUM, the personnel and administration measures, about times teachers spend at school. And specifically when it comes to the matriculants, so that we spend more time. But of course, it's quite a feature of our education system that teachers are always spending far more time with the matriculants than in the normal school day. We've also suggested that, of course, if we do break, and if the agreement is eventually around the month, that the matriculants will only break for the 2 weeks, which they at any rate were going to be entitled to, but to return then, because we certainly want the matric year finished. There's 1.2 million grade 1s that need to come into the system at the beginning of next year. And there are these almost 600,000 learners in matric that need to exit because of the higher education system. So we've suggested later exams, and of course we don't have an outcome yet, because there seems to be so much debate raging there. But we've also made other suggestions around how we are going to get the matric through a credible matric exam. The matric exam doesn't only have to be the examination that we know it to be.
Tim.
All right, let me,
Can I
yeah, go ahead.
I think we keep coming back to this idea of 2 weeks, that you're not wanting to close schools for the whole year, but just for the next 2 weeks. I'm not sure if that's a union position across the different unions, or if that's just a Naptosa position. But it's not clear what's going to be radically different in 2 weeks' time. It's not as if the virus won't still be spreading and all of the concerns that your teachers have. I can't see us closing the schools today and then reopening them in 2 weeks' time. If we close them today, if we're realistic, they're going to be shut for a number of months. But on this one, I think on the matrics, and I think it's really important to mention this. I've just posted a link to a paper to Stuart, to you in the chat. Hopefully you can share it with the people in the webinar. But basically it's an analysis that's showing that the learning losses that children are going to experience already, not just the matrics, that it will potentially take us till 2030 to get to the same level of learning outcomes that we had in 2019, because we're missing half of the academic year. Now, it's not possible to catch up an entire academic year in 3 weeks towards the end of the year, or to have the matric exam in the middle of January or the middle of February. You can't do 50% of teaching in 10% of time. The more that we keep schools closed, we are disadvantaging children potentially for their whole lives.
Nic, I just need to make a correction about the 2 week story. I didn't suggest that we are calling for a 2 week closure. No, we actually called for a month. What I'm saying is that the matriculants will only be closed for 2 weeks. I was trying to point out that the amount of time, additional time that is allegedly going to be lost now, doesn't amount to more than 2 weeks, because there would have been closure at any rate. It's on the calendar as we have it currently. And that is what I said at the beginning. Not that we or Naptosa is advocating for a 2 week. No. Ours is exactly in sync with the rest of the country, sorry, with the rest of the unions. But I wanted to make a point about the loss that you've said. You've posted this research there. Would you agree that if we used the year and the remainder of the year differently, and I'm talking about the GET and the foundation phase, where the two greatest weaknesses in our education system is about reading and about mathematics, and if we used this as opposed to trying to catch up a whole lot of lost content, we spent our time and energy to fix those two things, we would actually have gained more than we have in the last 10 years.
Okay,
So
but at this time, sorry, just a moment there, Nic. Do we have any guarantees that all the things that you say should be done in 2 weeks or should be done in a month have to be done first before you go back to school? Because in any event, the situation seems to be inconsistent from province to province in the first instance. But let me take this question from Gavin Pistorius, who says it is disingenuous to say that teachers are exposed to more people than other workers. And Gavin says that if workers can operate in shops, healthcare, etc., and that tend to hundreds of different people daily, surely the risk to teachers is much lower than the average people, a taxi driver, for instance, or somebody working in retail. If these people every day go to work and are exposed to risk, why shouldn't teachers be exposed to the same? And their risk exposure is actually much lower than that of other workers.
Tim, I needed to respond to two things. The question you asked and the question that has just been asked. First of all, will the system be ready? You know, with the little bit of pressure that we applied at the beginning of the reopening of schools, changed the fortunes of many, many thousands of children, simply because the department was quite happy to go back to school without even the basics being there. The basics such as water. There are more schools with water today because the unions made it happen. It didn't, and for 26 years, it didn't happen. And what did we discover? It was simply just the lack of checking why there is no water. Out of the 3,700 schools, I think there were 1,200 schools where there were just pipes that had been stolen, or pumps that were not working, or boreholes that hadn't been drilled deep enough. And those were changed. And then by our insistence, That and more toilets were given in the short space of a few weeks. So we mustn't minimize the impact this pressure has. So are we going to get everything right when we have this break? Because we do need to get a number of things. No, we're not. But we know that we are going to change the fortunes of hundreds of thousands of children. We cannot expect. Nic himself said, nobody's asking that teachers or children go into unsafe environments. And I'm saying to you that environments are still unsafe in many of our schools in the provinces I've mentioned. Insofar as being disingenuous about the dangers, it's an opinion. Let me also add that I've said it before, safety is a feeling and it's a perception. And the overall perception of both parents and children, parents and teachers, is that some of the environments are not safe and that they are at greater risk. If you look at the school attendance in Gauteng, as mentioned by the MEC, 23% of the grade R's returned, 56% of the primary school learners returned. And that is telling. And we want to change that because we want the learners at school, but under the right conditions. Now, that can't be seen to be unreasonable.
But what I think it might be unreasonable, Basil, is for the 70% of schools that are ready, that are safe, that have the PPE, that have toilets, why can't they go back now?
Well, and on top of that, there's a question from Brett Naderson, who says, how are curriculum supposed to be taught when children are psychologically impacted by the hysteria of the pandemic, specifically at the foundation phase level? The psychological impact on learners is being heavily underestimated. And Nic, I'd like to hear your view on that. And of course, you've asked Basil a question, which I expect him to respond to. But can you comment on what Brett is asking here?
Sure. And I think it also aligns well with something Basil mentioned earlier around trimming the curriculum and focusing on reading and maths as being one option of dealing with this. I think on the first one of the psychosocial support that's needed for children, there's a lot of research now that's showing that children being locked up at home during lockdown, that rates of childhood depression are really increasing quite dramatically. This was studies that were done in China, for example, where schools where schools were only closed for a month, and yet children experience much higher rates of depression compared to those at the start of that month. Now, we have had lockdown for much longer than that. So I think we are going to start seeing quite serious instances of childhood mental health problems that teachers are also going to have to deal with, and they need support to do that. But not going back to school is not the solution for that. But again, it comes back to the need for good communication and communicating to parents around this. On the second topic of trimming the curriculum, I agree with Basil that I don't think we should do business as usual curriculum when we do go back to school, although I think we should go back to school now. And the reason for that is no matter how we go back to school, we won't be able to do that. So whatever we do when we go back, we will have a limited amount of time, right? And I would agree that that limited amount of time, we should focus on the core, like reading and maths. Now, it's not clear that just because we're going to focus on reading and maths that it's going to fix that problem. Unfortunately, it's not like providing water to schools. Training teachers and providing new materials is a much longer term thing than fixing the water at a schooling system. So although some shift in that direction would probably help, I think that we should both focus on reading and maths and go back immediately for the schools where it's safe to do so. But I'm going to come back to that question, Basil. Why do you think that we need to close 100% of schools, even though perhaps only 20 or 30% don't have the basics in place?
Well, and also let me add Andrew Pinar's question as well, Basil. This is to you. Andrew's view is that the unions are completely out of touch with the reality on the ground, and that their actions are going to cause more trouble than we can imagine, and wants to know why, if unions are insisting on staying away from work, they do not embark on a no work, no pay sort of arrangement, so that teachers who are willing to take the risk can go to school and teach, and those who are scared or afraid for themselves can stay away and not be paid.
To answer to the latter, I don't think anybody wants to see a strike. We certainly don't want to see a strike about anything. Besides, we are advocating for the return to school. It is through the unions that the schools are back operational, because we supported it and we made sure that it happened under the right conditions. But I don't think that, Nic, your figures would be right, that 70% of them would be correct. I would want to say that 70% plus had the right materials with the first cohort, but that is not true with the second and third cohorts. I think the provinces have fallen much further back, but I don't have any stats to back that up. It's anecdotal, but it's reports from our membership, and we've done these surveys regularly where we've seen that. Now the question is it unreasonable? It's not unreasonable to have a break in the system. It's not unreasonable to say that this was at any rate going to be quite a normal time to break. So let us break, because our teachers also need it. Nic, you would agree that there were thousands of teachers who taught without a break throughout the lockdown, thousands of them. Some of them didn't expect that, of course, they would go back and that we'd have these long periods there together. They are at almost at breaking point. And all those schools have complained bitterly. And those are the well-heeled schools. Then, of course, there are those that try to make things work, even though it was extremely difficult. We are not giving them enough credit for how much effort they put into the lockdown period of keeping primarily matriculants on the road. Then there are, of course, the many, many who couldn't, because the systems just didn't allow it to happen. And we've got to acknowledge that that is also true. So, but we have one system, and can we start breaking it up into a multiplicity of systems? And that is the only reason I'm saying to you that we are saying, let's have the break. We will definitely be going back. There's no telling that we are not going to be going back, even though I've heard some suggestions being made here. Not true. The unions are adamant. And in terms of being in touch or out of touch, it is the unions that are more in touch with the membership. The Department of Education is not in touch with the teachers as much as we are. We have even organized, for Nic's benefit, we have started organizing webinars on how to teach reading for those teachers who do not know how to teach reading in the primary school, in preparation for this very instance.
So I think, Basil, I think that's great. The challenge that I would say is that I don't think, while I think it was very stressful for teachers during lockdown, I think that the vast majority of them, 80% plus, did not carry on teaching, not because they didn't want to, but because they were not able to. Only 20% of households in South Africa have a computer. Only 10% have an internet connection. There's only so much teaching that you can do via WhatsApp to a parent, for example. So I think that we need to be cautious about this idea that learning can continue even when schools are closed. For no-fee schools, that's simply not possible. For fee-charging schools that have wealthier children and parents that have internet and computers at home, yes, I think that your sentiments are true, that those teachers are overworked and stressed, and this changing of the calendar and the timetable is probably negatively affecting them. That's not the majority of teachers, though.
Can I just come in with one point? One of the things that we have done now in this time, there are many children at home that haven't come back yet. And many, many schools, I can't claim most of them, but I can claim that many of them have had the teachers that have been at school start preparing and sending home workbooks that children never had, texts that they never had during the lockdown. So much more has been done than I think we're giving it credit for.
And we are doing that as well.
Can we pause for a moment, Nic? I want us to take a step back and evaluate what has happened so far, right? As we try to imagine what the best way is to deal with the school situation. How much work or academic year has been lost so far? Not only in terms of time, but in terms of the content that has been taught the learners throughout the year up to this time. Because we left with how many months? 3 months before the end of the year, of the academic year, and we're still fixing water issues, we're still fixing sanitation issues, sanitizers issues, and so on. But how much of backlog do you think? How much lost time is there in terms of the academic year? And is there an opportunity for any catch up before the end of the year?
Yeah. So Tim, I think that the answer to that question partly depends on grade, because the grades didn't all go back at the same time. So for the grades that went back the earliest, I would say it's about 20 to 25% of days that have been lost, assuming that schools don't close for the rest of the year. For the grades that came back last, they will lose up to half of this academic year, up to 50%. And that's in this link that I sent out now. And that assumes that schools that they carry on rolling out as per the DBE's plan. In other words, that they don't close down again. So I think the range is between 25 to 50% at the moment. If schools close for another month or 2 months, that rate will obviously go up quite significantly.
And of course, there's another point that you made, Nic, and I want to pose it to Basil, that the opportunity to provide children with nutrition is also lost, that such children are being denied this nutrition if schools remain closed. So what about that then, Basil? Shouldn't they be opened at least for that purpose?
Tim, as I've indicated, that the people who make nutrition work are the teachers. It is not the people who cook, it's the teachers. And in fact, we are on record as we can show that in fact you can still feed the children, whether you have a break or not. And remember that tragically, when children go on holiday, they're not being fed. But this time around, we are saying we can actually manage that. We've shown by having these pickup centers for food that we can actually do that. We've shown that by handing out the dry food for cooking at home, you can assist in that. And then we've seen, particularly in Durban, where this had been done before, that we can get food to large groups of people by taking the food into the community on a coupon system.
So I think, Basil, this is that's to be frank, is disingenuous. You're not going to find new mechanisms of feeding 9 million children in 2 weeks. We have 25,000 schools scattered across the country, and those are the primary points that people are used to getting food from. To think that we can invent an entire new infrastructure for feeding 9 million children you're living in la la land if you think that that's possible. I think that it's not possible to distribute food to 9 million children without using teachers and without using the existing schools.
Let's weigh the risks here, because you did mention, Nic, earlier on that there are some grades that have already lost 50% of learning this year, and in some grades 20%, and the time that's remaining is what, 25%, 30% at most of the academic year. And I wonder how those who lost 50% are going to catch up. Be that as it may, let's now focus on whether to continue or not to continue, and whether with the limited time we can make any difference. What's going to happen to the grade 12s who are looking forward to entering the tertiary education system if we continue down this path? And what's going to happen to those who are entering the schooling system for the first time next year? Because I think the number runs up to what, 2 million, 1.5 million to 2 million of new entrants, and we only have so much infrastructure and this many facilities. So the risk is much higher if we do not continue in that sense. But compare it to the fear of contracting COVID-19, and according to statistics from elsewhere, and including the advice and information you're getting from scientists, Basil, they probably are telling you that the potential for the spread of COVID-19 in schools is much lower than it is in the broader population. So when you weigh the two risks, which one do you think should be considered going forward?
Tim, what I must say to you is that we will finish the matric year. And there are proposals on the table about how we do that. And one of them is, of course, that the exam has been pushed back quite far. But we don't have a final outcome there, right until the 22nd of December, so that sufficient teaching and learning happens before we start the exam. Yes, it is a stretch. Yes, it is difficult, but it is equally difficult to say to people who have had no learning during the lockdown that they must catch up for the time that we were on lockdown. And teachers have been working full out to try and make that happen. There are lessons every afternoon, there's lessons every weekend, and people are not necessarily seeing that because they're not in that space. And this is how we are attending to that. The 1.2 million learners that must come into grade 1 have to come in, because we have to clear the system at the top for those at the bottom to come in. And weighing up the risks. Yes, of course, at the face of it, the one risk seems greater than the other. But then we are ignoring some things. We are ignoring the psychological impact, because nobody's taking enough time to look at it. And I'm telling you, we are doing more harm than good. We think that it's not showing itself, but it is there already. And not only amongst the teachers, but also in the broader population. And we can't go on simply just ignoring that is a reality as well.
Nic?
Yeah, I disagree with that. I don't think that children being locked up at home is much better for them than being at school. I think teachers as well as experts are saying children need to be at school. That is what's in their best interest. You've just said yourself at the start of this, schools are the safest place for children. So I think what we need to be asking is what is in the best interest of South Africa, not what is in the best interest of teacher unions. And unfortunately, if the teacher unions are saying that we need to close schools, they're going to clash with the department who's trying to put the interests of parents first. Because in my view, it should be the choice of parents and children to decide whether or not they should go to school, rather than the fact that schools are closed and it's not possible to go to school. Ultimately, they are the ones who are the custodians and the guardians of their children. And the minister has made this very explicit from day one. Parents are welcome. If they do not feel safe, they don't have to send their children to school. They can keep them at home. And yet now, if we close schools, we're taking away that option entirely.
But Nic, wouldn't you agree that many parents are keeping children at home, but not for the right reasons, not because they can homeschool the children, but they're keeping the children home out of fear. That is why we need to ensure that the school environment is the right environment for the children to be at. And I stand by it. We still believe that the best place for children is in the school, under the right conditions. And the parent bodies are divided about how to support this. The NASGP, which is the largest parent organization in the country, supports the idea because their parents are feeling that this is unsafe. And we've got to also unpack why some governing bodies are supporting the return. And it's sometimes not in the best interest of children, but it's not for the best interest of children.
But
it is
Basil,
for some other reasons too.
What would you say to a parent who said to you, I visited the school, I've seen the PPE, I've seen the masks, and I want to send my child back to school because I have to go back to work or I'm going to lose my job. And I can't have my child at home, and I feel confident that the school is safe, that my child has a mask, and I want to send them back to school. What would you say to that parent?
I'd say to that parent, that is why we opened schools in the first place, because we too believe that. However, it is more than just the will of one parent or a parent group. We've got to look at the whole system. No, we've got to look at the whole system, Nic, because
so you
the system contains teachers as well. And,
well, you know, the sense I get here, Nic, listening to you and Basil, and also looking at the comments from so many people who are attending this webinar, is that people have a sense that it is the interests of the teachers that are being put first here, Basil. That it's the teachers who are arguing about their own safety, about their rights and their interests, and want to stay away from work, and not the other broader societal interests and the interests of the children. That should be what the key issue is about, because the arguments that I'm looking at here, for instance, suggest from Carol, for instance, who says our children are not considered first and foremost that their education is vital. And it appears there's very little concern from the teachers who are being paid during this time, that it is more the asserting of the employee rights than the delivery of education and the impact that education has on the broader societal interests. And that you are not focusing on that. You are focusing more on your own interests.
Can I say this, Tim? People talk about the interests of the union. It's not the interest of the union. It's the interest of our membership. And we must remember that we are a teacher union. And so we've got to take the interests of our members into account. But we can't, we're not a general factory worker where we can ignore the product that we work with. And that is why we've constantly looked at the interests of the child. Now, it may not be to the degree that some people think it should be, but we have considered the interests of the child. That's why we have stood out against a lot of criticism and against a lot of detractors to let our kids go back to school, to promote the going back to school, because we believe it's the right place for the children to be. But we are a teacher union.
Now, Nic, what is your view regarding what happened in Kenya, where they decided that once and for all they should just cancel the academic year, which actually, has gained some traction here in South Africa? There are people who are of that view, actually, who are thinking that the academic year should be cancelled and we should start afresh in 2021.
Yeah, so the first thing to mention is Kenya does not have an extensive school feeding scheme. So less than 20% of children in Kenya get a meal at school, compared to 75% of children in South Africa. So again, there's analysis on this that shows countries that have widespread school feeding schemes open their schools more quickly than countries that don't have school feeding schemes, because the communities and parents rely on those meals to feed their children. So I don't think that we should be looking to Kenya to try and figure out how should we close our schools for the whole academic year. And I suspect Basil will agree with me that that would be disastrous for the matrics, for the next 10 years, for the 1.2 million incoming grade ones, for the next generation of teachers and doctors and nurses and all of these things that require a new generation to come in each year into the university. We will feel it for the next 20 years if we close schools for the rest of this academic year. That would be a gigantic mistake. And the problem is, as much as Basil might be saying we have 1 month, I promise you that 1 month will morph into 3 months and we will be closed for the whole year.
But my question then is, okay, you've already identified the risks. Why are we going all over the place and not making sure that the schools are open, and then we put the pressure, apply the pressure on the authorities to deliver the PPEs and do other things that are necessary whilst keeping the schools open at this time? I mean,
and that would be my point, Basil. I think that the unions would do really well to put that pressure on.
I don't agree.
And an additional point is this, Nic, comment on this, and Basil, you can then follow up. The government or the department had to be taken to court to provide the nutrition to children, to open the feeding schemes anyway. The Western Cape apparently had them open throughout the lockdown period, but the rest of the country, the nutrition program was shut down. So what's your comment to that?
I think that's a source of national shame that the department had to be taken to court to feed 9 million hungry children. The problem is we won't be able to feed those children unless schools are closed, schools are open.
I would agree, but remember, we are not feeding 9 million kids at the moment, and that is also the way where one of the problems lies. But we agreed from the very outset that we needed to feed our children. And the department, of course, is squeezed, and we've got to acknowledge that. It's squeezed because there is no money, and the country recognizes that money is in short supply. But we've got all these additional expenses that we have to have, and we can't do without them if we want to keep the school safe. And so they've made decisions which tragically have not been the wisest decisions. So, and we've supported the case against the department in terms of getting the feeding schemes going. And we are delighted that that has happened. And we will see that the children get fed. But I do take a different view about the schools not reopening if we are going to break for a normal break. Certainly, we are committed to ensuring that the schools get back in time, and time will tell. I have no doubt that the chips are going to fall in support of a closure. I don't know if it's going to be what we asked for. We'll hear that in a few hours' time. But I will also say to you that that is not time that can be wasted. We have to use the time to achieve the things we've set out to achieve, including, but not limited to, making the schools ready for the full complement of learners. Remember, after this, the full complement of learners has to be back at school.
Well, this issue that we're discussing has an impact on broader society, especially parents and families. And Nic, I know you've done some work and some research on this score. tell me, how are parents affected by the fact that schools or in some parts remain closed or specific grades are not yet back at school? How is this affecting family life and affecting the working lives of these parents?
Sure, Tim. And if I can, I have another meeting that I have to run to in 2 minutes, so this will have to be my last comment. But yeah, I'll leave the end to Basil to sum up. I trust that he will do that accurately. There's been a massive impact of the lockdown on parents. So 3 million South Africans have lost their jobs, and of those, 2 million were women. Now, that's not a coincidence. The poor, those that are less educated, those that are in the informal sector, they're the ones that have had the greatest job losses. But the fact that 2/3 of job losses are on women, I think, is not unrelated to the fact that schools were closed. The increased childcare burden while schools are closed has fallen more heavily on women than it has on men. So women find it more difficult to look for work and have many more hours. I think it was something like 70% of women reported more than 4 additional hours of childcare while schooling was closed. So I think that the types of conversations that we are having here around school opening and school closure are not just about learning outcomes in children. They also have very huge knock-on effects into the economy, into gender inequality, and a number of other factors that we try and highlight in that NIDS-CRAM study that you mentioned, Tim. But thanks for this conversation. It's been really helpful, and I'm glad that, Basil, that you and I could engage on this. Thanks, Tim.
And thanks very much, Nic, for taking part on this webinar. And Basil, thanks again, Nic, much appreciated. He's the senior researcher with the economics department at Stellenbosch University. And Basil, what is your take of how government has handled the provision of PPE, sanitizers, and other measures at schools? Can you give me a sense from the perspective of the unions, how they handle this? And we've been reading horror stories about what's going on in the Eastern Cape. So give me a province by province breakdown of how the COVID situation has been managed at schools.
First of all, there's very poor reporting. And if you listened to the minister on the 4th of May, all the provinces indicated that they were ready to accept the children. And then we did a survey. And 13,000 schools participated in the survey. And it showed that most of these schools hadn't received a single PPE. And then, I mean, you had the MEC of Limpopo say, we are absolutely ready. And then upon inspection, there was nothing there. And this has been the pattern throughout the country, except for Gauteng and the Western Cape that were more ready than most, and Gauteng has big gaps. It is not completely there. But in every province, there are gaps. The Western Cape is probably the best off. But the sheer scale of the gaps differs very widely. KZN, Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Mpumalanga are by far the worst achievers here. And then not too far behind, we have the Free State. The Northern Cape, because it has a very, very low number of schools, has been sort of cruising under the radar by and large. But there too, even with their limited number of schools, they haven't also done very well. So initially, everybody thought the spotlight was on, and so they complied. And then when they thought the spotlight was off, we saw these big gaps being created. And this is where the fight is now, because we are saying these are consumables. They get finished, they get used up. And if we want our schools to be healthy places, we must keep them clean. And many of the schools are no-fee schools, so they can't go out and buy cleaning material. The cleaning material has to be supplied. Similarly, with things like masks. Look at the Northwest. It brought back its second cohort of children with 1 mask each. Yet the law says that whether in a work environment or not, you have to supply 2 masks. And so those children haven't even had the opportunity to see that the masks are washed on a regular basis. So this is exactly where we are at. We are at a place where I don't think government has delivered. And I don't think the political will is there to correct the people who are doing the wrong thing. Look at KZN, where there's been the theft of billions of rands of PPEs that have just evaporated into nowhere. Look at the Eastern Cape, where they're buying data at millions of rands, whilst you can go to an ordinary spaza shop and buy it for half that price. And this is what our problem is, that there has been, notwithstanding the crisis, a lot of skullduggery that has happened, and that has put us in a bad situation.
Now, which raises this question, from your perspective then, what do you think poses the bigger threat to the academic year? COVID-19 or corruption?
Certainly, corruption is up there. And the lack of commitment and political will. I don't believe it's all corruption, but surely the department can do much better. There was a clip on television showing the MEC of Mpumalanga standing in a school where the toilets were in an absolute state. And his statement was, no, this is a great improvement. I think this school can open. And we looked at it, and in fact, we dispatched people to the place. It was way, way outside what we would call an acceptable set of circumstances. So, Tim, yes, COVID is a big threat, but COVID is an opportunity. And we need to see the opportunity in education, because it's not all gloom and doom. And we certainly have been trying to embrace it, but we are not being blind to the threats that come with it.
So as I've indicated, we are here now. When you look at, you do a risk assessment of the situation, where do you think we're going to end up ultimately? I mean, every day we're losing, and several opportunities on a day-to-day basis, right? Corruption is not going to be wiped out immediately. It's not going to be dealt with, and PPEs are not going to be delivered on time, as we know, for some time to come. So how do you think the academic year is going to end up like?
Tim, the academic year was never going to be normal with the outbreak of the COVID virus. It was never going to be. And the impression that people tried to create was that we want to save the academic year. We rather said we wanted to save learning, because we know it's not about the academic year, it must be about continued learning. And we've never believed that you can save a whole curriculum. But we are the masters of the curriculum. We know what should be done. We know what the core things are. And the step we are missing out on is 2021. Because 2021, if we don't succeed now in sorting it out, where we ensure that those steps that are critical to move from one year to the next aren't captured into the 2021 curriculum, we are going to find ourselves having the same debate again. We've said to the Department of Basic Education, we need to start looking at the curriculum, removing the extension parts from the curriculum, and ensuring that we do the double build with those critical concepts from the previous year that may have been lost out on. Because in every subject there will be those. And if we don't do that now, then we set ourselves up. So it's not about saving 2020, it's about saving education. And we will make some choices that are not unpopular, that are not popular, sorry, and hopefully they're not too unpopular so that we can live with them. But we as a union, and I can only speak for Naptosa, we are committed to ensure that the academic year does get completed in one way or the other. We are also committed to seeing that the matrics move out of the system, and that, of course, we see that next year is being attended to. I too am on a tight rein here. Tim, by 10 past, I must be on a program.
Well, we will be done in the next few minutes. I wanted to ask a question. I think it's Brett again, who wants to know how the authorities or the department is managing teachers who are living with comorbidities, and as union, how you are representing them. Have you encouraged them to stay away, and have they been replaced?
At the moment, that hasn't been the biggest crisis. We've got many teachers are off on comorbidities, and we've struck an agreement within the Labour Relations Council, the ELRC that is, which allows for that to happen because, of course, they are at much higher risk. However, the application of the the collective agreement has been uneven throughout the country. That's the first issue. And so we've had to then deal with it, particularly in the Western Cape, first with every single case. Unfortunately, these things can only be dealt with individually. And we are getting it sorted out. The replacements are happening now. When the second and third cohort of learners started coming back, then the pressure started increasing. At first, the teachers were not there were not necessarily being replaced because you could find a teacher within the group, unless, of course, it was an absolutely specialist subject. But however, now, with more coming back, you have to start bringing in teachers. And provinces are beginning that, but that is going to be the next fight, because when we have the full cohort of children back, we cannot but have every post filled, and that is not yet there. Only the Western Cape, but the Western Cape is also not filling these with teachers. They are filling them with they have a term for it, but it's people that are almost fully qualified that they are utilizing at the moment, because there's also the lack of the sheer number of teachers that are required in certain places.
So tell me, as we grapple with this issue, you've got the things or issues that you would like to see the Department of Education do before you get your members back. You've placed the demands with the Department of Education. How do you think this is all going to end up? And I'm thinking also of the situation at private schools, for instance, private education. It appears there are no problems there. You know, that the schooling there is continuing as per normal. And clearly learners who attend those schools will be having, again, an additional advantage as compared to the public schools. Implication is that public education would have failed the people of South Africa and the children of South Africa.
Tim, it's a perception, because the private schools have their own problems, and they are varied. And as with public schools, they too are having many infections happening, and they too are closing at random. But of course, the system is different, because money makes the system work, and they are able to do that. Insofar as public schools are concerned, we certainly are trying our best under very trying circumstances. And I want to say that we will apply pressure, as is our role, and it will improve the conditions for thousands and thousands of teachers and hundreds of thousands of children. And that must be recognized, because we cannot allow the department to take shortcuts with this, because government has been allowed to take shortcuts. That's why 26 years later, we still have schools without toilets, and we still had schools without water. And it is only the pressure from organizations like ours that has changed the fortunes of those many, many people.
Well, as we conclude then, the biggest risk to education again, Basil, COVID-19 or corruption?
Well, unfortunately, it's a cocktail. And both of them are having their own disparate impact, but definitely corruption is stealing even more. Without corruption, we could have done so much better, but it's not going to evaporate.
Thanks very much, Basil Manuel, for having been with me on this webinar. Appreciate your presence representing Naptosa. And thanks for sharing your views with us, as well as the attendees of this webinar, my first one here on Biznews. Thanks for giving me the welcome, and again, appreciating your questions. We will update you on the next one and the topic that we will be having for discussion on Biznews. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye, Tim.